All right, today we are diving headfirst into the politics of America's Gilded Age. It's this wild period of incredible wealth and booming industry, but at the same time, just shocking political dysfunction. And we're going to explore how these two extremes weren't just happening side by side, but were actually deeply, deeply connected.
So the big question is, how does that even happen, right? How can an age of incredible progress also be an age of, well, spectacular political failure? How does all that money and power lead to both massive corruption and these huge, powerful movements demanding radical change? That's the puzzle we're going to piece together today.
Okay, so let's jump right into this central paradox. The politics of the Gilded Age. It was all about this really strong belief in a hands-off government, laissez-faire. But what that did was create this huge vacuum, and that vacuum got filled with two things: corruption and a government that was basically paralyzed, unable to get anything done. So to really get a handle on how this all worked, we've got to look at the two big political parties. And you have to remember, if you were around back in the 1870s or 80s, your political team was probably still decided by the Civil War. That conflict cast a really long shadow. So on one side, you had the Republican Party. They were big in the North and the Midwest. You're talking union vets, business owners, and Protestants. They were all about high tariffs to protect American industry, and they were huge fans of the gold standard. Then you had the Democrats. Their power base was the Solid South, but they also had a lot of support from immigrants in the big northern cities. They usually wanted lower tariffs, but honestly, they were often fighting amongst themselves on money issues. But here's the key. Despite all those differences, they were both running on the exact same fuel. And that fuel was what's called the spoils system. This is so important to understand. For both parties, winning an election wasn't really about passing grand legislation or solving the nation's biggest problems. Nope. It was about one thing: getting to hand out government jobs to your friends, your supporters, your relatives as a reward. That system, that was the engine driving the whole political machine. But this whole system, this idea of rewarding loyalty instead of, actual skill, it was deeply dug in. And it was about to get blown wide open by one single shocking event. An event that would completely and kind of accidentally change the game forever.
It's just a tragic, unbelievable story. In 1881, President James Garfield was assassinated. And the shooter? He was a frustrated guy who thought he deserved a government job because of the spoils system. It was this horrible national tragedy that just laid bare how dangerous and, frankly, how absurd this whole system had become. The public was outraged, and that outcry was the spark that lit the fire for real reform.
And that fire led straight to the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. Basically, it said you had to pass a test to get a federal job. You had to be qualified. On the surface, this was a huge win for the reformers. But, and this is a huge but, it had this massive, unintended side effect that completely changed how politics was paid for.
So think about it. If you can't promise jobs to your supporters anymore, what do? Parties still needed money to run campaigns, right? So where did they turn? You guessed it, wealthy corporations and rich individuals. And just like that, political power started shifting. It moved away from the local party bosses who used to hand out jobs and straight to the railroad tycoons and the factory owners who could write the biggest checks. And well, as you can imagine, when politicians start listening more to their wealthy donors, they tend to listen less to ordinary folks. At the very same time, farmers out in the West and the South were getting hammered by an economic storm, and that storm was about to ignite a political firestorm.
The biggest fight was all about money itself, literally what our money was made of. On one side, you had the creditors, the bankers, and the big industrialists. They loved the gold standard. It kept the money supply tight and stable, which is perfect if you're the one lending out money. But on the other side, you had farmers and anyone in debt. They were desperate to add silver into the mix to expand the money supply. Why? Because they were getting crushed by deflation, which was making their debt feel heavier and heavier every single year.
Let me break down how that squeeze actually worked. The money supply was fixed, but the economy was growing, so prices for things like crops kept dropping. So imagine you're a farmer. You took out a $1,000 loan when your wheat sold for $1 a bushel. A few years later, that same bushel only sells for 50 cents. But guess what? Your loan is still $1,000. You now have to grow and sell twice as much wheat just to make the same payment. You're literally working twice as hard just to stay in the same place. It was a trap.
And all of this desperation, this pain, it found its champion in a man named William Jennings Bryan.
He gave one of the most famous speeches in American history, the Cross of Gold speech, where he thundered that the powerful interests were trying to crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. What a line. This groundswell of suffering eventually boiled over and created a new political party, the People's Party, or as everyone called them, the Populists. And look, this wasn't just some little third party on the fringe. This was a full-blown movement of farmers, of laborers, of anyone who felt crushed by the power of big corporations. And in 1892, they laid out all their ideas in what they called the Omaha Platform.
And the things they were demanding? Whoa. For the 1890s, this was radical stuff. They wanted the government to take over the railroads and telegraph lines, which they saw as monopolies that were ripping everybody off. They demanded a graduated income tax, the idea that the richer you are, the higher percentage you pay. And this is a big one. They wanted the people to directly elect U.S. senators, instead of having them picked by state lawmakers who are often, bought and paid for by corporate interests. Okay, so you've got this populist fire raging across the countryside. But meanwhile, back in the big cities, a completely different kind of political power was at work, and in many ways, it was a lot more effective. I'm talking about urban political machines, and the most famous one was New York's Tammany Hall. Now, on the one hand, these guys were wildly corrupt. I mean, we're talking vote buying, stealing massive amounts of public money, the whole 9 yards. But, and this is the really interesting part, that's only half the story. They also acted as a kind of rough-and-tumble social safety net for poor and immigrant families. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of an immigrant family who just arrived. You need a job, it's freezing, you need some coal for heat, you get in trouble with the law. The official city government, it couldn't care less. But the local guy from the political machine, he shows up. He gets you a job, he brings you coal, he helps you out, and all he asks for in return is your vote on election day. Yeah, it was a corrupt system for sure, but it delivered for people when the actual government wouldn't. So we've kind of got these two different Americas happening at once, right? At the national level, a government that's stuck, paralyzed, and listening to big money. And at the city level, these super efficient, super corrupt machines that are actually getting things done for people. Which brings us to our last big question. So the Populist Party itself, it pretty much fizzled out after the big election of 1896. So does that mean the whole movement was a failure? Did all those radical ideas just vanish? Well, this is where the story gets really, really interesting. Remember those crazy ideas from their platform? The ones that people in the 1890s thought were just totally out there, even socialist? The amazing thing is, a lot of them didn't disappear. In fact, they ended up becoming the law of the land. Think about it. The 16th Amendment gave us the graduated income tax. The 17th Amendment gave us the direct election of senators. Both of these became law only about 2 decades after the populists were shouting about them. We're not talking about small changes here. These were fundamental shifts in how American government works, and they came straight out of the populist playbook. And that really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? The Populist Party lost the election, sure. They failed, but their ideas won. It just makes you wonder, what does it really mean for a movement to succeed or fail? Maybe sometimes losing in the short term is how you win in the long run, by completely changing what everyone agrees is possible.